What's up, guys? It's Josh with SobrietyWoD. If it's your first time, welcome. If you've been before, welcome back. Glad you're here. Today I wanted to talk about a topic that I titled Freedom for What? Sorry. And you know, I was just thinking about lately sort of my experience with my resistance to authority and kind of how that played into my addiction and my life. So like growing up, you know, I always resisted rules. You know, I didn't understand, or if I didn't understand a rule, I didn't want to follow it, or I just didn't follow it. And so, you know, I spent a lot of time getting kicked out of schools, pretty much every school I went to, and it was always from what we used to call like bucking the system. And I had this idea in my head that if the rules weren't there, then I wouldn't be in trouble all the time, right? So if there wasn't a rule that you couldn't talk out of turn, then I would never get in trouble. And like that's how early on my kind of like twisted thinking, and I'm sure it started before that, but to even think in terms of it's the rule's fault, not my fault, you know? And it's like, it's kind of true. If it wasn't a rule, I wouldn't have gotten in trouble. But most people don't think about it that way. They just think if they would stop talking out of turn, they would stop getting in trouble. And, you know, I think that it's a pretty common thing among addicts that we have this issue with rules, right? We're pretty defiant, we're pretty stubborn, pretty strong-willed when it comes to what we think is right and wrong or what we should be able to do. And so I had this notion of freedom, and this idea of freedom for me was freedom from authority or freedom from rules. And so I always thought, man, if I just, when I get out of school, I won't have all these rules to follow. When I turn 18, I won't have all these rules to follow. And then everything will be fine because the rules that I'm breaking won't exist anymore. So I can stay the same and the situation will change and everything will be fine. But it didn't take long before I realized there was just maybe some rules changed, but then there was this new level of rules. And whether it be like laws or society or whatever, there were still rules. There were still limits to my freedom. And so it just started over there with bigger consequences, right? Like the higher level of rules we get to, that bigger the consequences get. And so I had to realize that my whole idea of freedom as being freedom from authority or freedom from rules was not really an actual possibility. I mean, even if you lived on your own island somewhere, you would still have to observe the law of gravity. It still exists. Like you still have to work within that. You can't just will it to not be that way because you don't like it or you don't agree with it. They always exist, and at the end of the day, to me, that's kind of like a higher power thing. It's like, I can't change it no matter how much I want to. But I ran into cops, you know, ran into jails, ran into hospitals and institutions with that idea of like, you're not gonna experience that kind of freedom. And so I had to realize, or I had to think what kind of freedom, or I had to be shown what kind of freedom I actually was looking for, the freedom that I needed. And the freedom that I needed was the freedom from self-will. It was the reverse side of that. It was, I needed the power and the freedom to not feel like I had to buck the system all the time. I needed the freedom to obey the rules because I could not do that. Same with drinking, like I could not drink. And the only way that I cannot continue to buck the system is if I find a source of that freedom. So for the discussion, I want you guys to talk about kind of your experience with authority. If that's part of your story, be interesting to see if that's kind of one of those common things among us. So you guys just, I think that's what it says. Yeah, most of us to some degree have had a problem with authority at some point. Was this your experience? So you guys enjoy your discussion and we'll be right back in a second.